So I'm so excited for tonight's program, and I want to extend a huge thank you to our co-sponsor for tonight's program, the City of Wheaton Community Relations Commission, and specifically Rachel Batista of the Commission for putting together this wonderful panel tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you. So thank you again, everyone. On behalf of the City of Wheaton Community Relations Commission, thank you all for joining us tonight. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Community Relations Commission, we are a group of local volunteers, and our purpose is to be a catalyst in the community, to connect all people and make everyone feel united with Wheaton through events, key partnerships, and opportunities to give back. You can visit the Community Relations Commission page found on the City of Wheaton website for more information, including information on our events and programs, especially those that we have this month in recognition of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We are proud to co-sponsor tonight's event with the Wheaton Public Library, as well as in partnership with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for helping us to lead this important discussion so that we can all learn about what we can do to better support our Asian American neighbors and friends, especially in light of the rise in violence against this community in the past year. So I'm going to turn it over now to Raymond Chang, who's going to be our moderator tonight, as well as the rest of our panelists, to have them introduce ourselves and then kick off the discussion.
Well, thank you so much to the City of Wheaton's Community Relations Commission and to the Wheaton Public Library, both to Rachel and Courtney, for inviting us to participate. As mentioned, my name is Raymond Chang, and I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And I also serve at Wheaton College as a campus minister. And so I'm glad to be invited to share with the City of Wheaton, and hopefully this can be a powerful resource and a useful resource for those who are tuning in now and will tune in later. I'm really thrilled to introduce a couple of my colleagues who I'll ask to introduce themselves, and then I'll introduce kind of I'll lay out the framework for tonight. And so maybe I can start with you, Dr. Pam Barger.
Hi, everyone. I am Pam Barger. I am the assistant professor of TESOL, which stands for Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages at Wheaton College Graduate School. So it's my privilege to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Chuck Liu. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and at the very moment, I am in Honolulu, Hawaii, but I am a faculty member currently at University of Hawaii, but in the fall, I will be faculty member at Wheaton College.
And Dr. Chuck Liu was a Wheaton student, so he's familiar with the Wheaton area. So he graduated from Wheaton. Well, so we're here because Rachel and I connected I want to say a couple months ago, or maybe a month ago, and celebrate and to AAPI Heritage Month, wanted to put on some events in conjunction with the library. And one of the things that we brainstormed about was an event that actually talked about the stereotypes that pervasively harm our communities. But just to kind of give some context to what's going on recently, as COVID-19 began to spread and we witnessed the rise of rhetoric that would toggle harmful attitudes against the Asian American community by our nation's most powerful leaders, we knew that it would take some significant efforts to address the anti-Asian hate and the racism that was on the rise and has surged ever since. At the Asian American Christian Collaborative, which you can check out on our website, you can check us out on our website, asianamericanchristiancollaborative.com, or on Facebook, Asian American Christian Collaborative, or AA Christ Collab on Twitter and Instagram. We actually released a statement that quickly garnered over 10,000 signatures from people throughout the country. And then as we continue to track the rise of anti-Asian racism, which Stop-AAPI Hate has reported that over 6,600 cases since March of 2020 have been reported, we've seen Asians shouted at, spit on, shoved, stabbed, and even killed. We have seen that our children have been bullied, our elderly have been pushed to the ground, and the women of our community have been targeted and massacred, as we saw in Atlanta. I've personally experienced anti-Asian racism myself when I was standing outside of my house, basically minding my own business, reading a book, and someone drove by and yelled in a truck, yelled, "You yellow piece of," and an expletive. But I'm not the only one. Many of our students at Wheaton have also experienced similar things in and around town, and then of course around the country. We did a survey at Wheaton College and try to figure out what percentage of our students experienced discrimination and racism. And we found that over 40% had experienced an incident, and then over 70% of them were directed at Asian females. Some of the slurs that were used included kung flu, wu flu, Chinese virus, Jackie Chan, Jeremy Lin, bat eater, Chino Jap, COVID carrier, and other slurs. Many of us heard that we should go back to our own country. That many of us are currently still afraid of for the elderly in our communities, and many of us are disheartened by the lack of engagement and real substantive action around these issues. So that's why we're grateful to the Wheaton Public Library and to the city's commission for putting on an event like this. Grace Meng, who's one of the congresswomen, have said that we've gone from near invisibility to hypervisibility as Asian Americans, and sadly, much of it has surfaced around old tropes of Asian Americans being treated as yellow peril or a virus that has infected society. We, as I mentioned before, toggle between the model minority myth and the perpetual foreigner syndrome, and these stereotypes harm those who don't neatly fit into the stereotypical imagination of what an Asian American should look like as well. And so many people don't realize how much these stereotypes pervade our experiences, whether we like it or not. And that because of the conditioning of our society, it has affected a lot of our imaginations, which is why I'm so glad to have my wonderful colleagues share on each of them. Dr. Pam Barger is going to share on the perpetual foreigner syndrome, and then Dr. Chuck Liu will share on the model minority myth. And then after they share, we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up as either of them are speaking, or even as I was kind of framing the discussion, please feel free to submit them to the Q&A section or into the chat, and then Courtney will host the Q&A afterwards. So I'll turn it over to Pam.
Thank you so much, Ray, for sharing and introducing us. And as Ray mentioned, almost all of us have gone through, attacks. I've been personally been stalked at a grocery store a couple months ago. Just as I was exiting off a grocery store in Naperville, someone was stalking me, and it was intimidating. And so I just wanted to kind of come here and share my voice and share about the perpetual foreigner stereotype. So I am going to share my screen with all of you. And again, I just want to thank the City of Wheaton and the Wheaton Public Library for allowing us to just share this opportunity. And my hope and my goal is for us to learn a little bit more about what this perpetual foreigner stereotype is. And as I will share in the overview section, I'm going to share about myself. I feel like, just for you to understand who I am, this perpetual foreigner stereotype has actually been in my existence since the very beginning. And so it's a really good time for me to kind of share a little bit about my own experiences and who I am. After I share a little bit about myself, I'm going to give you a definition of the perpetual foreigner stereotype. I'm also going to give you the historical scope. Now, there's so much into our history here in the United States, but I'll kind of highlight some 4 events that kind of have helped shape this perpetual foreigner stereotype, and to kind of share a little bit of the darker side of the American history as well, and also the implications, especially the psychological implications with the perpetual foreigner stereotype, and the conclusion. So a little bit about me. I am 2nd generation Thai American, and to kind of go over what generations is, both my mom and my dad, my mother and father immigrated to America separately. They met each other here in Chicago. So I was born and raised in Chicago. 2nd generation means I was born in America. So my mother actually immigrated to the States, and my dad around the same time, but they immigrated separately. During the 1965, they had an immigration act. It was called just the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act that allowed many people, including Asians, to come here. And my aunt came here to study as a nurse. And she was recruited to be a nurse in the south side of Chicago. So my mom decided to accompany her. She wanted a better education. My dad came as well for a better education here. And my aunt had been a nurse in the south side of Chicago for over 60 years until she retired. It was actually at Jackson Park Hospital where she was. At that time in the 60s, they recruited a lot of nurses from Asia, including the Philippines and Thailand. And so my aunt was, was very fortunate to come here and really wanted to study nursing and just excel at nursing here. As I mentioned, I was Chicago born and raised. I was born in the south side of Chicago, obviously Jackson Park Hospital, but I grew up in the north side of Chicago. And, I've been a city girl all my life, and I've been in Wheaton for over 15 years now. And throughout the life, even though I was born in Chicago, I always had questions about my identity. So throughout life, even recently, I had someone ask me, when did I come to America? I know my accent is not atypical, but I had these questions about when did I come to America? Or your English is so good, or you are so exotic. These are the types of microaggressions, which I'll talk a little bit about, of perpetual foreigner identity. I wanted to share a couple of pictures here. So throughout the slide, I'll share a little bit about my stories in addition to photos. And if you look at the top left, it's a picture of my husband and me. And my husband, a fun fact about this, he is a grandson of the mayor of Wheaton, Mayor Ralph Barger, and he was the mayor of Wheaton for a number of years. On the right is a picture of me. I just wanted to have a picture of myself. And on the bottom is a picture of my mother, and I wanted to kind of share a fun fact about her. As I mentioned, she accompanied my aunt as a nurse, and she wanted to open up a Thai restaurant. Back then, in the late 60s, early 70s, no one knew what a Thai restaurant was. But my mom was a very business savvy person. She was one of the first handful of people who opened up a Thai restaurant on Lincoln Square. And she knew that no one knew about Thai food. So what she did is she called it Chinese food. So if you look at the bottom picture, the black and white picture, that's a picture of my mother. And the restaurant was called Taiwan, which is actually daylight in Thai. And it says Chinese food, chop suey. Back then people knew of Chinese food and chop suey. And she was very business savvy, that she knew that people, in order for people to come there, she had to make it as a Chinese food. So she kind of altered her food a little bit with a Thai twist. And so customers who were there then questioned and asked her about what this is a unique Chinese food. And then she explained what Thai food was. And so people were very drawn to her. So it's a part of Chicago history that my mom did, she was opening up the first handful of Thai restaurants. So before I talk about the perpetual foreigner stereotype, I want you to kind of think about who is an All-American to you. When I think about All-American, I remember I had this conversation with my doctoral cohort in Chicago, and my cohort consisted of a Mexican-American, second-generation Mexican-American, and another American who was half African-American and half Caucasian. As we were talking about All-American, I actually thought of my husband. The first thing I thought about was my husband. He was raised in Wheaton. He was a high school football player, and he was white. So some of the pictures that I thought were these characters. So these are characters from Friday Night Lights. When I think of All-American, I tend to think of white people, especially white high school cheerleaders or usually white football players. And then my coworker, at that time was my cohort member, says, "But you're an All-American too, Pam." And it took me aback, when I thought of that. And I was like, "You're right. I was an All-American. I did sports. I did very well in school. I was born here. I did a lot of extracurricular activities, but for some reason, I didn't associate myself as All-American. I thought of my husband immediately. And I want you to think about that because Americans are so many people. And these are some of the top Asian American leaders that are all American. For example, that picture right there is of Dr. Johnny Kim. And Dr. Johnny Kim, at 36 years of age, he was not only a US Navy SEAL member, he graduated with a degree in math at University of San Diego, and he was a Harvard Medical alum. And he's also the first Korean American NASA astronaut to embark on assignments to the moon and potentially Mars. He's All American, Johnny Kim, but do people really think of him as All American? And another one who is All American, kind of close to my heritage, is Tammy Duckworth, who is Thai American. Her mother is Thai and her father is American. And I really wanted to share this quote. I remember this. Her Senate campaign at 2016, and it really kind of struck a nerve to me because at that time she was debating with her then opponent, Mark Kirk. And then during her campaign, she asserted that her family served America in uniform going back to the revolution. Obviously, Tammy Duckworth, Senator Duckworth, she served in the military during the Iraq War as well. But she proudly asserted that her family had ties to the American Revolution. Right then and there, during the debate, Mark Kirk says, quote, "I've forgotten that your parents came all the way from Thailand to serve George Washington." And it really struck a nerve with me when I heard that. People called that remark offensive and racist. He apologized afterwards. And although Duckworth's mother is Thai, her father's family had actually been in the US before it became a country. And his father's family was a Revolutionary War soldier. So Tammy Duckworth not only served in the military, but she also studied for her doctorate. So she had a PhD in NIU, Northern Illinois University. And so for her, I consider her as an All-American. So what Mark Kirk did was bring this perpetual foreigner stereotype to her. Even though she probably assert that, he assumed that her family's from Thailand and didn't serve in the military. So what is the perpetual foreigner? It's also called the forever foreigner, which essentially is the members of ethnic minorities such as Asian Americans, even Latin Americans, African Americans at times. They're not truly American and they're considered as others. You hear this perpetual foreigner stereotype a lot in the Asian American circle. So whatever we do, even though we were born here, maybe some of us served in the military, because of our look, because of our hair color, our eyes, or our accent, we are considered the forever foreigner. So this perpetual foreigner has the idea is to be American, is to be white, even white Anglo-Saxon European Protestant identity. And I will share to you about some of the historical factors that affect this perpetual foreigner stereotype. So as Ray had mentioned about the yellow peril, what is the yellow peril? And the yellow peril is a brief history talking about a person who is of Asian heritage is considered unclean and unfit for citizenship in America. And in American history, we've had a pretty dark history with regards to how Asian Americans have been treated. One of the big ones is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this was the first significant law that restricted immigration into the United States, particularly to Chinese laborers and minors, from entering the country for 10 years. Back then, there were a lot of Chinese immigrants coming in the late 19th century, and many white Americans were at times very upset because they were taking low-wage labor, such as in restaurant or laundry work or mining. And so many white Americans viewed that they were taking their jobs away. So this Exclusion Act came for 10 years. And I wanted to share some pictures with you. So if you look at the bottom left, the black and white picture, it's fascinating to see how much political cartoons were there at the time. This black and white picture of the Chinese man sitting there, you can't really read it, but I'll read to you. It's a political cartoon about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And it says, on the left-hand side, it says, notice, communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen, the only one barred out. We must draw the line somewhere, and that's a Golden Gate of Liberty. I'll talk about the Golden Gate of Liberty in a little bit. And so that's a political cartoon making a satire out of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the one on the right-hand side is actually, local to Illinois. It was a magic washer, 1886 advertisement. And this was in Dixon, Illinois. The bottom, you can't read it very clearly. As you see, it was Uncle Sam kicking a person of Chinese descent and a number of Chinese descent, like out there. And I wanted to read specifically about this magic washer and what it said. It says, in the bottom, it says, the Chinese must go. We have no use for them since we've got this wonderful washer. What a blessing to tired mothers. It costs so little and won't injure the clothes. As I mentioned back then, a lot of Chinese immigrants who came here worked in laundry services. So this magic washer wanted to talk about this new washer to help the tired mothers, the white Americans. And there's no need for the Chinese or Asian American population as well. So as you could see, this yellow peril stereotype, this perpetual foreigner stereotype has been in existence since the early 19th century. Another aspect too of being yellow peril of Asian heritage is Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco. And so when there were Asian immigrants who came here, many of them came through the Angel Island, San Francisco. Therefore, that's why you saw the 1882 kind of satire on the Golden Gate, because that was Angel Island. And just in terms of how the Asian immigrants were treated as perpetual foreigners, unclean and unfit for citizenship in America. When many immigrants arrived here, were divided by nationalities, and many people from the European context, especially the Northern European, they were told that they could go, but for Asians, they were kind of more ridiculed, and you could see that they were divided by women and men. So in the bottom right picture, you could see the women were divided entirely. There were forced medical exams. They were humiliated, as you could see in a top right photo. All these were children who had to be half naked. They couldn't speak English at the time, but they were forced to take these medical exams without their permission, and they just didn't know what to do. In Angel Island, for about 30 years, from 1910 to 1940, over 225,000 Asian immigrants were detained, and they were under oppressive conditions for as long as 6 months. They were in this station for 6 months. So as I mentioned about the yellow peril again, these Asians were perceived as unclean. They had disease carriers such as smallpox, bubonic plague. They were a threat to white Americans for jobs. As you can see, history has repeated itself through the coronavirus as well. It's been this cycle repeated. SARS was not that long ago. Now it's COVID. But for Asians, they were always being perceived as yellow peril, as unclean or carriers of tropical diseases. Another dark history was Executive Order 9066. This is 1942. It was signed by President Roosevelt, authorizing Japanese relocation during World War II. So this executive order incarcerated people who were considered as enemies. And for enemies, it was Japanese Americans. And they were forced to go to interment camps. During this Executive Order 9066, about 120,000 Japanese Americans, 62% were American citizens, were forced to sell or dispose their homes and businesses without even due process and were told to be in the camps during this time. And so these are some of the pictures of the repercussions of Executive Order 9066. And another dark side of American history too, of being a perpetual foreigner, was just Vincent Chin in 1982. Back then, there was in terms of economy, there was the American automobile system versus the Japanese automobile system. Toyota was doing really well, and auto workers in Detroit, was very upset with losing jobs or losing their services. So in the 1980s, they sledgehammer Toyotas and other Japanese imports because of the fear of competition. And during this 1982, there was 2 white auto workers in Detroit. They killed Vincent, who was a Chinese American engineer, and they killed him with a baseball bat, because they thought that he looked Japanese, even though he was a Chinese American engineer. He was about to get married, and he was celebrating his wedding. But then, unfortunately, the 2 white auto workers killed him. And what was an uproar about Vincent Chin's murder was the fact when these 2 men were prosecuted, they were only prosecuted of manslaughter. Each only received $3,000 fine, $780 in court costs, and only a 3-year probation. There was no jail time whatsoever for these automobile workers. And if you see on the bottom right, it's a picture of Vincent Chin's mother crying in despair, hearing the result of the verdict. And so Vincent Chin is one of in Asian American history, is really one of the one that we talked about in terms of the unfair due process of how Asian Americans have been treated here as perpetual foreigners. But it's not only in American history too. Hollywood has a very unfortunate depictions of Asian and Asian Americans, of Asian American men as being nerdy, effeminate, to Asian American women being sexualized. And I really wanted to share about this quote from Norman Weiss. This is from Primetimer, and he said that, quote, "Reducing Asian to flat, heavily accented caricatures is a favorite pastime in this country, and has been for decades. Mocking Asian men as weak and effeminate is so common that it's become a white noise for many who hear it. Asian women have long been reduced to dehumanizing stereotypes, whether meek, speechless, or hypersexualized." And as you can see, some of these pictures depicts men as effeminate or nerdy. The one on the top left was from Mickey Rooney from Breakfast at Tiffany, which is actually, Mickey Rooney is a Caucasian actor, and he was being depicted with a Japanese character. The one on the bottom right, the bottom left is Long Duk Dong. He's an Asian American actor in 16 Candles, and he was depicted as a nerd with a very thick Asian accent. And the top right was from Revenge of the Nerds, Brian Toshi as Takashi. So these men were again depicted as nerds and as effeminate. And the bottom right depicts women as, again, meek or hypersexualized. And this has affected me very much because during my high school and even college career, I was approached by a number of white men. And these men were wanting to go out with me, and I said no. And they, called me vulgar names. They expected me to respond to them in a positive way, and I didn't have a good feeling about them. And, being depicted as exotic or as sexualized, it's just really it's something that I've had encountered a lot during my high school and college career. And I just still to this day, I still have a hard time with the word exotic just because of what I've heard about who I was as a person, as this perpetual foreigner stereotype. So I wanted to share a little bit, about Googling American women and Thai women. And it's interesting to see how Google searches what a woman is. So I wanted to share this. So this happened this weekend as I was Googling this. As you can see, American Woman, it's a common song. It's a popular song by Lenny Kravitz. So on the left-hand side was just some of these Google-related searches when you Google American Woman. And pretty much is American Woman is a song by Lenny Kravitz. It's a popular song. When you do related searches, is American Woman lyrics, American Woman song, who wrote American Woman, Lenny Kravitz, who sung that song. When you Google a Thai woman, on the other hand, this is what you see. These are the related searches. And, for me, being a Thai American woman, it's really hard to see that, never marry a Thai woman personality traits, don't marry a Thai woman, or how to marry a Thai woman. And there's even more searches about Thai women and sexuality. And so these are the common Google searches that people do. I don't know how Google uses analytics or what, but these are the related searches of what Google sees as American woman versus a Thai woman. So it's very interesting to see the perpetual foreigner stereotype being here. The implications of the perpetual foreigner stereotype. And I really liked what the study did by Sue and Kettle Dillip. Is looking at the psychological implications. And it helps me to understand myself as an Asian American woman. The perpetual foreigner stereotype are assumptions that minorities such as Asians or non-Americans manifest through racial microaggressions or subtle comments. So in this case, you'll hear well-intentioned people probably asking the wrong questions. Perpetual foreigner stereotype comes in questions like what we call microaggressions, such as questioning an individual's hometown. Not only where are you from, but when did you come to America? Did you really come to America? Were you really born here, for example? Really questioning the individual's hometown, even though I say, when people ask me, where are you from? And I say, Chicago. No, are you really from Chicago? Questioning that. I hear that quite often. Complimenting his or her English language, especially as an English language teacher, I get that very often, where even my own students who come from various parts of the country said, teacher, you speak English well. But I said, I was born here, but they still ask that. But not only them, I hear it from my Caucasian colleagues as well. Mistaking him and her as a foreigner. As I mentioned, I had this one just a couple weeks ago. As I mentioned, I was Thai American. My parents are from Thailand. I had a colleague recently saying, oh, even though I mentioned that my family is from Thailand, this colleague who's Caucasian says, thank you for sharing about your Taiwanese heritage. And so there's another perpetual foreigner stereotype. And again, some of the implications with these microaggressions is the lowering of psychological and mental health, sometimes depression, anxiety, stress, disengagement, anger, and frustration. So all these things that I have felt with the microaggressions, I was very thankful to read this because it helped me understand, just kind of my journey and my identity as an Asian American person. In conclusion, although equality is a core American value, many ethnic minorities, such as Asian Americans, still feel less American due to the perpetual foreigner stereotype. The simple awareness of being seen as less American or more foreign influences the individual. Obviously the implications of the perpetual foreigner stereotype can bring these psychological implications, such as, again, depression, anxiety, you feel not good enough, you have to work even harder to prove yourself. And for those, just, the big thing for me, the takeaway is just to be kind, to listen to our stories. When you ask questions, just remember to ask it broadly and let us share our stories. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
right. I guess I can just go right into what I was asked to speak about today. Let me share my screen here. All right, can everybody see that okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. All right, so a little bit about myself, as we mentioned earlier. My name is Dr. Chuck Liu. I'm going to be teaching at Wheaton College in the fall, and I am a clinical psychologist by training. My research areas happen to be in the area of culture and racism on Asian American mental health. And actually at this very moment, I'm running a study along with one of my colleagues at the college, looking at the impact of discrimination against Asian Americans during COVID-19. Thank you, Dr. Barger, for sharing some of your personal experiences. A little bit in terms of my own background, I was actually born in China, but I came to the US at the age of 4. Both of my parents were academics that came to get their higher degrees here in the US. And my dad actually came over as a consequence of the Chinese government crackdown on academics after Tiananmen Square. I appreciate the ways in which Dr. Barger was able to connect some of the information that she was presenting with her own personal life. And I think my approach is going to be a little bit more on the topic, but I just want to say that I really resonated with a lot of that. Those were a lot of the shared experiences that I had as an individual growing up in a predominantly white suburb of New Jersey. And similarly, when we talk about the model minority myth, I have a lot of experience with that as well. And it's actually taken me a really long time to, it took me into my adulthood to start unraveling some of these internalized beliefs and to understand where they come from, why they exist, and how they affect individuals like myself and affect people who hold those beliefs as well, right? Not just Asian Americans, but also the broader community and the broader society. So I want to talk a little bit about the Asian American stereotypes broadly. And defining stereotypes, I'd like to start off by just saying, a stereotype is a generalized belief about a group or category of people. It can also be defined as a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. And oftentimes when we think about stereotypes, we think about negative stereotypes, right? If we think about stereotypes of various different racial groups, oftentimes they are negative in nature. And some of the stereotypes that Dr. Barger presented are also negative in nature. But then sometimes we have what we would put in quotes as positive stereotypes. And sometimes we think of them and we say, well, they're stereotypes. They're good stereotypes about this group of people. Certainly they can't be harmful. Certainly there can't be anything wrong about thinking that this group is positive in this sort of way, right? We think about African Americans, there's sort of a quote unquote positive stereotype that they're athletic, right? When we talk about Asian Americans, there's a positive stereotype that they are a model minority. And so for today's discussion, I'd really like to focus a little bit on what is the model minority stereotype? Where does it come from? Why is it in fact a myth? Why do I say it's a model minority myth? And why is it a problem? So if we start off with simply defining what the model minority is, there is an assumption, intentionally or unintentionally, that Asian Americans are smart, oftentimes good at STEM, right? Sciences, math, technology. They are academically high achieving. There's an assumption that Asian Americans are financially well off. And there are some character traits that are also attributed to this model minority stereotype, that Asian Americans are quiet, they're docile, they're hardworking. And Dr. Barger mentioned the sort of emasculated male, right? That they're nerdy and that the women are sexualized in a certain way. And then just as a little bit of a fun one, there's often the assumption that Asian American kids play they're musicians, right? Of which I'm guilty. So, intentionally or unintentionally, these sorts of beliefs are floating out there in society, in American society. And these beliefs about what Asian Americans are or what they're good at essentially becomes essentialized as somehow being inherently or genetically, that Asian Americans are inherently genetically better in these areas. They're oftentimes held in contrast to negative attitudes or negative stereotypes about other racial groups, right? So where does this stereotype actually come from? Now, racial stereotypes in the US always fall under the framework of how the dominant group, right, white European American majority, has engaged with individuals and groups who are not of European descent. And let me just be very clear, I'm not saying that racial stereotypes don't happen in other countries or other cultures, but that specifically in this case, in the context that we're in, we're being situated in the US and we're grounded in US history. So that's what I'm going to speak about. Where does the stereotype come from? So prior to the civil rights era, as Dr. Barger so adequately explained, Asian Americans were viewed with suspicion. They were considered dirty, right? They were called the brown hordes or the yellow peril. And they were generally viewed upon with suspicion, negativity, and weren't really welcomed. The example that she also gave was this Chinese Exclusion Act, which lasted from 1882 all the way to 1943, which didn't allow not only immigration, but didn't allow Chinese to become citizens, naturalized citizens in the US. And, you know, we can say that it finished there, but it actually didn't finish there, right? Promptly after the Chinese Exclusion Act, after that was repealed, the Magnuson Act was enacted, and that allowed for the generous number of 105 Chinese immigrants to come into the country and allowed for them to become naturalized citizens. So this is something that, you know, wasn't that long ago, where there were institutional ways in which Asians were being discriminated against in the US, saying nothing of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II as well. And there was a distinct shift during the civil rights era. This happened not incidentally, but in I think it was 1967 or 68, the idea of the model minority came into the larger American conversation, cultural conversation. It was publicized by a sociologist by the name of William Peterson. And he wrote an article in the New York Times called The Success Story, Japanese American Style. And he argued that Japanese Americans were horribly discriminated against during World War II, but look at them now, right? So this is really interesting. As the civil rights movement by Black Americans started gaining steam, individuals in society started saying, wait a second, look at the Asians. They work hard, they keep the peace, they're quiet and respectable. They certainly don't complain about their lot in life or their discrimination by protesting. They don't march, they don't riot. And the implication was, why can't you Black people be more like those quiet, peaceful Asian people who are not complaining about the way that they're being treated? So the model minority stereotype was literally created during the civil rights and latched onto by the broader white Euro-American culture to undermine the civil rights movement. One group, Asians, were being used and pitted against another group, Blacks. Unless we have historical amnesia, more than 70% of Americans at that time disapproved of the protests during the civil rights era. And Martin Luther King was widely detested at that time, right? We kind of think of Martin Luther King Jr. now as this, you know, hallowed civil rights leader, but people hated him at that time. So there was a lot of reason to undermine it, and Asians were being used during that time. The model minority stereotype was being used at that time to undermine the civil rights movement. So, you know, I mentioned earlier how I'm currently living in Hawaii, and we see that in Hawaiian history here, right? As a transplant, I had to do a lot of learning about different various groups, ethnic groups here in Hawaii. And what we saw is that predominantly white owners of land when Hawaii was colonized, they would run sugar plantations, pineapple plantations, things like that, right? And they would import large groups of foreigners. We're talking about Filipinos, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese. And once one group, one ethnic racial group became entrenched and became so present that they started advocating for their rights, they would quickly bring in another group, separate them, and have them pitted against each other so that they would fight against each other, and therefore they couldn't organize and advocate for themselves. So this is actually an old trick out of a very old playbook. It's used very frequently, and we saw that during the civil rights era, using the Asian Americans being pitted against Black Americans. Now, we forward to today, and we ask this question, well, why is it a myth? Maybe it was a myth at that time. Is it still a myth today? And one of the things that we see when we look at Asian Americans as a whole, right? If we aggregate and collapse all the Asian Americans together as a whole, and we look at their data, their statistics, we actually see that Asian Americans as a whole have the highest median household income compared with other racial groups, including above white Americans. We see that Asian Americans as a whole have some of the highest rates of college education, more so than any other racial group. And as a psychologist, I'm interested in mental health, and we see that Asian Americans as a whole have lower overall lifetime prevalence rates of mental illnesses. So these are the types of data points that are often used to argue that, in fact, Asian Americans are a model minority. How can you say that they're not if there is data that supports that? So why, in fact, do I call it a myth? Why do people call this a myth, right? And it's because over aggregation, right, if collapsing Asian Americans altogether, obscures reality and diversity of experience. Let me say that again. Over aggregation obscures reality and diversity of experience. So when we look at the way that the US Census Bureau categorizes who is Asian, there are actually 19 different ethnic groups in the US Census that fall under the category of Asian. And frankly, there are more, but those are the groups that the US Census decided to use, right? And if you think about it, there's 19 different ethnic groups within Asian American. Each of those ethnic groups has a different overall immigration pattern and story. And there's diversity even within each of those ethnic groups. So for example, many Japanese Americans have been in the US for multiple generations. Many of them came to the US prior to World War II. But if we look at Chinese immigration, for instance, there's a varied history. Some from the 1800s, right? Multiple generations have been here. I have a friend who attended Wheaton here for multiple generations who was Chinese American. And there are other later waves of immigration after 1960s. And for instance, my parents who came in the 80s, this was allowed by US immigration policy. Who was permitted into the country was dictated by US immigration policy. Other groups, particularly Southeast Asians, oftentimes came as a result of war and refugee resettlement, right? They didn't necessarily come seeking educational opportunities. They didn't come because they were looking for business opportunities. They came because their countries were torn apart by war, or their ethnic group was collaborating with the U.S. government, and for instance, Vietnam War, because the U.S. lost, they had to be evacuated and transplanted. So others, like Southeast Asians, come from and other groups like South Asians come from strong education, skills, and technology backgrounds who came particularly because the US opens its doors to people with high education and high skills. As you can imagine, people who come from very different places and very different reasons for immigration might have very different experiences and outcomes in the US. If, in fact, once we disaggregate into various different ethnicities, we see a very different picture for different groups. So some of these this is a little bit small, you might have a hard time seeing, but what you can see here is that among Asian Americans, you actually see among all racial groups, the largest wage gap and income inequality between the highest and the lowest earners out of any racial group. In large cities, there is significant poverty in many of the immigrant communities, but the model minority myth doesn't talk about that. It glosses over it. It paints Asian Americans as being successful, and so we don't see it or hear it. For example, Indian Americans, right, South Asians, have median household incomes above 100,000, but many of the Asian ethnic groups who arrived as a result of refugee resettlement or war, like Vietnamese, Laotians, Hmong, Burmese, etc., they have much lower median household incomes and oftentimes live below the poverty line. And the way that median household income is measured actually begs the question, how is it calculated, right? Because oftentimes immigrant communities have larger families that are living together under one household. So if you're calculating household income and there's more individuals in the household, you're comparing it against perhaps a smaller nuclear family unit for other types of Americans. Here we see a similar pattern in college education. College education follows the same patterns, right? Keep in mind that education levels are deeply impacted by immigration history. The US immigration system prioritizes and privileges people with the resources necessary to immigrate, certain levels of income, education, technical skills, etc. There is a self-selection bias that is happening that prioritizes and privileges an unrepresentative slice of Asian individuals, allows them into the US, and those who did not self-select to come, right, and these are the people who are a result of war, indigenous groups like Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, they have significantly lower than average education rates compared with the rest of the country. And because I'm a psychologist, I'm really interested in Asian American mental health. We actually see, despite the overall lower rates of lifetime prevalence rates of mental illness, most of those are actually in severe mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar. There's a lot that gets buried as a result. We actually see higher rates of some specific mental health diagnoses, such as anxiety and depression among Asian Americans. And here's a really interesting fact that is, when I first learned of it, was very surprising. Asian American women under the age of 26, so young Asian American women, and over the age of 35, older Asian American women, have the highest completed suicide rates out of all racial groups. Right? If Asian Americans are the model minority, why are Asian American women killing themselves at such high rates compared to other groups? And this is particularly true during the COVID pandemic as well, with the increase in racism against Asian Americans. We're looking, in my study that we're running, we're looking at increased rates of depression and anxiety as well among Asian Americans, for those, particularly those who are experiencing discrimination, and there are a lot of folks who are. Again, among Asian Americans tend to have some of the lowest rates of seeking mental health services, and by the time that they seek mental health services, they oftentimes have more severe symptomology than other groups. So the problem with the model minority and some of what we're talking about here in over-aggregation, being clumped together hides a lot of this diversity and hides a lot of these realities that many Asian Americans experience. Which leads us to this question of, why is it a problem, right? We started with, this seems to be a good thing to have the larger population believe that you are good at math and good at science and smart. Why is that a bad thing? Part of it is because fundamentally it's important to recognize that the very origin of this stereotype was specifically created and used to put down African Americans, and continues to this day to be used as a wedge that inflames racial tensions between Black and Asian Americans. This in and of itself is worth a whole separate talk, but suffice it to say the very existence of the stereotype is problematic and has contributed to strained relations between Black and Asian communities in the US. And I just want to note that our Canadian neighbors up north actually don't have this stereotype about Asians, right? If you ask a Canadian about the stereotypes for Asians, the model minority doesn't actually come up for them. It doesn't exist there. So think about that. It's idiosyncratically and distinctly an American stereotype grown out of the racism and racial dynamics within this country. Second, it's inaccurate. So many Asian Americans do not live up to these assumed stereotypes. And again, it ignores the experience of many groups and individuals who fall under this umbrella of who is considered Asian American. It essentializes and generalizes traits to all Asians, to the exclusion of reality. And it's not incidental that the ethnic groups that show the highest rates of education and material attainment happen to be the ones that were allowed to come to the US because they were already highly skilled and educated individuals, or because they were self-motivated to immigrate. It's not genetic, it's not inherent to being Asian. It's history, politics, and racism. Research also indicates that while this positive stereotype sometimes does encourage individuals to work harder to live up to that stereotype, we find that the endorsement of the model minority stereotype among Asian Americans also predicts worse mental health outcomes. It's very constraining to have everyone around you assume anything about you, either positive or negative. And then lastly, positive stereotypes, right? Stereotypes that highlight success also make it more difficult for individuals who don't live up to that stereotype to actually seek help. This is a huge one for Asian Americans, as it contributes to individuals not seeking mental health services. And for folks who are in the community, teachers, providers, who interact with Asian Americans, having this stereotype can also cause them to overlook signs of struggle, whether they are in schools or in doctor's offices. Asian Americans get overlooked for support services, and only when horrific racist attacks happen, like during this pandemic, is their attention focused on racism against Asian Americans. So as an overview of what the model minority myth is, I hope this is helpful in giving a little bit of a crash course on what we're talking about, where it came from, why it's wrong, and why it's a problem. And I know we'll have some more opportunities during Q&A to sort of elaborate on this, and I'll end my portion of it here.
Well, thank you both to you, Chuck and Pam, for the illuminating presentations. I mean, it was a really great overview of like two of the most pervasive, and they're not the exclusive stereotypes, but the most pervasive stereotypes that impact the Asian American community. As you were talking, Pam, I looked behind my desk and I realized that there are a couple things I have in my house that I think would be helpful for people to see. um you can't really see it. So this one's called Every Dog Has Its Day, and so it's right before the Chinese Exclusion Act. This actually is an original from 1879. I found it online, and it's a Chinese person looking at the rising anti-Asian racism and how um, they're about to be excluded. And so you have the Native American person telling the the Chinese man that every dog has its day. At one point, they're going to push you out, and the Chinese person is looking at some of the history that's outlined here, and then an essay that was written about how the Chinese must go, and then here's kind of the use of the Chinese who helped build the railroad, and in the back is an African American who's basically saying that his day is coming. And so it's worth looking up, Googling. Every dog has its day. No distinction of color. It's worth kind of exploring and seeing how racism has impacted entire communities. The other thing I have is actually an original uh, order, Executive Order 9066, to get people to enter into or to go towards incarceration camps. And so for all persons of Japanese ancestry, so regardless of their loyalties, their patriotism, or whatever it is that they might have possessed, they were ordered to basically go with one bag to a local kind of staging station. And so they were all over the country, and then from those staging stations, they were sent off to incarceration camps that were situated. And what most people don't know is that people were actually they were actually sent from other American or North and South American kind of countries to the United States to go to these concentration camps. And so you would have people from Peru that were sent over, and other kind of Central and South American countries, just because they were of Japanese descent. And I remember the one story I consistently tell around this is how um, I was at church, and one of our church members brought their grandfather to the church, and he kind of told me about his upbringing and how he was placed in as a child. He Once he heard about Pearl Harbor, he pretended to be John Wayne shooting down the plane. So that was kind of his way of playing. And the next thing he knew, he was in an incarceration camp with his family, and so they lost so much due to that. And then when they returned back to their homes, much of it was gone. So many came to Chicago or other cities to start a new life. Just to kind of ground it a little before we turn it over to Courtney for some Q&A, uh, if you've ever heard like Asians are good at math, or you've heard stereotypes about women's sexuality or Asian women, or if you've ever heard about the accents, these are all stereotypes that continue to um, perpetuate a narrow view of who Asian Americans are, and then it puts us in these racialized cages that don't allow us to actually be all that we could be in many ways, because we're constantly battling these stereotypes. And so anything from the questions around where are you from, where are you really from, as if we can never really be from here, no matter 5, 6, 7 generations of being in the United States, to how good we are at math, or how successful we are. They do create challenges. And so I'm looking forward to some of the questions that are coming in. If you haven't asked a question, please do so. You can either send it to the Q&A or into the chat, and then we can go from there. But Courtney, we want to jump right in?
Thank you all so much for those wonderful presentations. Our first question, do any of you have any insight on best practices in our school curriculums? Are there certain topics, historical events, or resources for educators beyond celebrating AAPI Heritage Month?
I uh, I don't know if I could share some of the links, but there definitely. I mean, there's a lot of AAPI things such as Asian Pacific Heritage.gov. I really like the history, history.com. It had one, like if you just even search on Asian Americans, you can see how it integrated a lot of the Asian American curriculum. So I'll put some links on. Should I put it on a chat box or just to show some of the things? But Smithsonian also has a great one on just incorporating Asian American content into the curriculum as well. So I guess I would say the best practice as an educator, because I'm an educator too, is really especially if you have students who are of Asian American descent or of any other heritage as well, is to really bring their voices, bring their authors. If there's so many more books from a variety of diverse authors. So just bringing their representation, bringing their voices and having them hear about it. So this history.com, for example, it talks about Asian American women who were big factors in terms of World War II. I had no idea about that, but it was a really great way to integrate, just diverse experience in that. So I think the best thing is to integrate these diverse audience or diverse voices in your curriculum as well. So I'll share some of the links.
And if I can just follow up with that a little bit. When we're thinking about representation, it matters so much for kids to see people who look like them in adults, right? Either teachers, like if you have them as teachers, that's amazing, right? But if you don't, seeing them in books, seeing them represented in spaces outside of the specific month that represents their racial background, right? That just means a lot, even if you don't hear them saying anything about it. To be treated as like, hey, this is actually part of American history. It's not just specifically Asian American History Month, but this is everybody's history, and somebody who looks like you is represented in that. The other part that I would just sort of caution about, and oftentimes this comes from a good, well-meaning place, is sometimes teachers will ask a specific kid. They might be one of the few Asian American or Black children or Latinx children who are in the classroom, and you say, hey, can you share about this thing that your family does, right? That's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of singling out that they may or may not like. It's possible that they would enjoy sharing that, right? It's not a given that they don't want to do that. But I think just be very careful that you're not necessarily imposing upon them to do that, that you as the educator, you're doing the work necessary to do the research and to present these kinds of things. And if you have other people, adults who you can reach out to just to make sure your facts are straight, or you're not butchering the pronunciation of something, like go and reach out to them, right? Don't put it on the kid to have to be the one who educates everybody. There's a good chance that they are often already feeling singled out, right, in those types of spaces. Even if it's well-meaning, don't accidentally do that.
And the Illinois State House recently did pass the Teach Act, which is a bill that's trying to get Asian American history to be taught in our schools. And so I believe that it's still moving towards the Senate, and so we have to see what's going to happen there. But you can support the work that the passage of the bill by reaching out to state senators to encourage them to get the bill passed.
Thank you. Our next question, for those of us who are not Asian American, what can we do to help break these stereotypes?
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is I kind of have a two-prong answer, right? One is being aware of your own assumptions. That's first, is just becoming aware that, all right, I kind of try to take away the shame of holding these things, because the shame is not helpful. Like, we live in a culture and society where these beliefs are common held, and it's not like most people went out of their way to go and believe these sorts of things that are harmful, or hurtful, right? Like, as an Asian person who grew up in a predominantly white school, white suburb, I believe these things about myself. Like, we call that internalized racism, right? That these beliefs that existed outside myself, I believe these things about being an Asian. And so the first step is recognizing and acknowledging that, like, hey, I have some of these beliefs. It doesn't make me a horrible person, but I need to be aware of when these are coming to play when I'm interacting with other people, right? Catching yourself so that you yourself are not perpetuating these. And then when they are being perpetuated, having the boldness to be able to say, hey, like, wait a second, like, that's not great, like that's not necessarily true, right? Like that's an assumption. That's not helpful, it's not funny, right? Like, you know, um so simultaneously understanding where you yourself might hold some of these beliefs and working on that, and also intervening and interjecting when those beliefs do come up.
I wanted to echo what Dr. Liu had said too in terms of assumptions. I think the fact that you're here, I think it's a really big platform, and just to listen to the stereotypes. I think that's really a great step. As you hear and listen about these stereotypes, really, again, look at yourself. When you meet someone of Asian American descent, just be careful of how you ask these questions. Ask them as if you are asking the same questions to yourself. I think that's a really great way. And listen to our stories, instead of assuming, like I said, where you're coming from or anything, just having the time and taking the time to listen to our stories, be kind, and really being our advocate, especially when there's another person of non-Asian descent, when we need our advocate, we need to have your voices heard and defend and help us as well. So I would say the big thing, practically is just to listen, to show kindness, and just to build relationships. Read these stories. There's a lot of great information online about just the history of Asian Americans in the United States, even around the world. But I would say the big thing is just to be kind and to be listen.
Our website will have a lot of articles that people can read. It does come from a Christian kind of, so it's like the experiences of Asian American Christians. But I think a lot of that just kind of pervades beyond the Christian faith, just because we have to navigate our society as Asian Americans, whether we're Christian or not. And so there are some resources on AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com. I think that there's a few things that I kind of generally recommend all people do if you want to kind of understand kind of minoritized experiences. One is to learn the history. So, one of the most helpful things for me when I learned about the African American community was to learn about the history and the rich tradition of activism and resistance to racism and systemic injustices. And then through that, I really understood what the plight of the African American community was, why there was so much of a particular narrative and particular experiences that emerged because of those particular histories. And so the same thing is true for many Asian American Christian or Asian Americans. Just read our histories, and then read the books about the lived experiences that many Asian Americans have. Like Kathy Park Hong wrote a book called Minor Feelings, and that's a really great book to understand what's going on. Check it out at the library. Hopefully the Wheaton Public Library has some copies of it. And then also change your patterns of community. So patterns of engagement need to change. And so it's one thing to dip into a session like this, or even to have like a conversation every now and then with with someone in your kind of like broad social groups. But like, I'm a Christian, and so one of the things that is helpful for me is the regular rhythm of engaging with people on a weekly and even multiple times a week basis. But there are community kind of gatherings and other kind of entities like that are based on different affinities, where you can rub shoulders with people who are different from you. And if you combine the reading with actual real meaningful engagement, I think what Chuck was talking about starts to subside, because you actually have conversation partners where you're able to both like demonstrate that you're committed by doing your own homework and doing the work yourself, but also navigating the conversation. So one of our colleagues, his name is Greg Lee, and one of the things that he's like been consistently saying, basically since he's lived in the Lawndale area, is there's such a different conversation when you live in Lawndale, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood that's under resourced. He's like, we don't have questions about whether racism exists or what racism X, Y, and Z looks like. We just know that it exists, and we have to constantly work together to address it. And so, which community you're involved in does shape your perspectives in some significant ways. And so, that's something I would encourage.
Thank you. Ray, you mentioned how Wheaton College did a survey to better understand what Asian students were experiencing due to the rise of violence. Can you share how Wheaton College has been supporting students during this time? And is there any support we can apply at the city level?
Yeah, I mean, so Wheaton kind of is like it's a little town unto itself because it's a residential college, and so within the college we have counseling services, we have the chaplaincy, and so that's where I work. I basically work as a pastor at the campus. We have incredible faculty like the two that presented today that are really thought leaders and experts in their particular fields, and then we have a host of other kind of opportunities, including affinity groups and kind of groups that kind of help racialized minorities kind of connect. And so we had a multi-pronged approach, really, where our counseling services made an offer for any student who wants to get counseling in the midst of all this, because there were a higher number percentage-wise of Asian Americans that were affected with mental health issues during COVID. And so they were mindful of that. From our office, we did kind of services of lament, where people could kind of gather and pray together and basically share some of the things that they were experiencing. Um, and then offering kind of one-on-one pastoral counseling is something that I did. And then we also, through AACC, Wheaton College has a college chapter. We put on a summit that would talk about a variety of issues, as well as the faculty, which Pam was a part of, put on a panel for what the experiences of Asian women were like. And so we had a high attendance there. And then the Office of Multicultural Development also had some events for Asian American Heritage Month, which we celebrated the month before in April because the school is out in May, and so including like an Asian American Heritage or Asian Heritage Festival, which was probably one of the best experiences or best events that Wheaton has ever had. They did basically an outdoor festival with live music and what do you call it? Those dunking pools where you throw a ball at someone at a dunk tank. Um, and so there were probably about 10 or so different things that were made available.
Thank you. Our next question, as a first-generation Indian who is aware of the model minority myths and how it has created this wedge between racial groups, I found our role in the discussion about racism and systemic racism difficult. I try to acknowledge that my experience is not the same as that of our Black community, while recognizing that my family and I experience racism regularly as well. Have you found any good methods in navigating this?
That's a really big question. I don't know that I can adequately address that in this Q&A, or that I even have final answers for any of that. But I do think that recognition, like you said, is one of the big pieces that different groups, because of histories, because of the way in which we're racialized in this society, have different experiences, right? Even my experience as a Asian American male is different than Dr. Barger's, who is an Asian American woman, right? And so there's sort of these intersecting identities that kind of affect the way that we experience society in the world. And I think the recognition of that and the acknowledgement of that goes a really long way, of being able to say to people, your African American friends, of saying like, listen, like we have very different experiences. They fall under the same umbrella of discrimination, but they're different from each other. We are racialized and discriminated against and have different expectations put on us, and none of it is great, right? And so one of the things that I try to remind folks is that at the end of the day, we are all in this together. It's not an oppression Olympics, right? It's not about who has more oppression. It's categorically different. We experience different things, and insofar as our experiences can build empathy for other groups, that's great. And that only goes so far, right? And so the next step after that is to show up for people, right? When there are protests that are happening, and the Black community is really hurting. That's not just an African American issue. That's not just a Black issue. That's an us issue. And so show up for those types of things. And the hope is that when we recognize that, even though our experiences are different, we're ultimately in this together. And I know it's a little bit of a non-answer, but I hope that touches on that a little bit.
I wanted to add too, I think what Dr. Liu said was really great. Just to continue to empathize and just be an advocate. But it's good to acknowledge your experiences. I think it's important for your voice to be heard. As you mentioned, you're a first generation Indian American, and it's great that you have that outlet. Know that you're not alone in this particular journey, your identity, as you're processing your identity here, and I know that there are outlets for you to share your voice as well. So I'm very thankful that you share this. I think as you navigate your journey here, I hope you find someone or a community of people that will listen to you. And I think the biggest thing is to build relationships, to really build relationships with people of diverse nature, the Black community, the white community, the Asian American community. As you mentioned, the Indian, being Indian is much more different than myself, and so, but having our voices heard and listening and navigating our process is important. It's important for us. So I really hope that you find a place and an outlet that you share your voice and also continue to build a relationship as well.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think one of the things that we need to realize is that each kind of different racial group is racialized differently, and so we different kind of labels, tags, stereotypes, issues, some overlapping, some more kind of directly connected, some more loosely connected, impact us in different ways. And so understanding how racism, racialization impacts each of the communities is going to be important. And then some things just require, a different level of force and energy and effort. And so, I think what Chuck says is right. We have to learn to regularly show up for each other, and and participate not just at the large protests, but in the school board meetings, in the small conversations that you have with a group of friends where they might be saying something that's very troublesome and perpetuates problematic thinking, or in decision making kind of committees, where people of color might be present or not. And so, so whether we're there or not, to kind of be mindful of all that.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. So now is, last chance if you have any questions for our panelists before we end for tonight. Okay, there's one more. It was mentioned about the impact of mental health because of these stereotypes. Can you share how that's changed amongst the Asian American community due to COVID? As a community, are there things that we can do to help address or support the state of mental health?
Last year, I had an opportunity to speak at a talk talking about how, why, what is the experience of Asian Americans during COVID? Like, how are people experiencing this racism? And I think for a while, because Asian American issues were kind of invisible and Asian Americans in general are a little bit invisible, all of this sudden attention was very shocking, right? Like many of us have lived for a really long time with just kind of casual racism. I don't know that we had experiences of being singled out and attacked, right? Like we get singled out for various different ways. I got kind of picked on mercilessly at school as a kid, but I was never attacked. And all of the sudden, when COVID hit, it wasn't just worrying about feeling like a foreigner or feeling like you don't fit in or not seeing yourself represented and having these kind of stereotypes put on you. All of a sudden, it was active physical danger, right? Like people were literally unsure of what would happen to them when they left to go to the store to get groceries. And I just have so many friends that people here, you know, even among the three of us, people who experienced verbal and physical assault as a result of simply stepping outside. So that was categorically different, and more significant, I think, for a lot of Asian Americans who bought into this idea that if we kept our heads down and didn't say anything, that we would be accepted. And I mean, COVID basically revealed that that's not the case, right? No matter how hard you work, no matter how much you present yourself as being more closely aligned with your white Euro-American culture, none of that prevents you from being viewed as an outsider. None of that all of a sudden prevents you from being treated as somebody who is dangerous, right? So that really spiked for Asian Americans during this pandemic, and really led to some increased mental health challenges for a lot of people. And it wasn't just, you know, even if you as an individual never experienced it, there was always this fear, right? You just know people who experienced it. You saw it on the news, and you were worried about your elderly parents because it happened. It could happen anywhere. It happened in Naperville. It happened to my faculty colleague who was jogging, you know, on the prairie path, right? Like these things, you just never know when it was going to happen, and that adds a significant level of stress to anybody's life.
I will share, like, one of our students said that she doesn't let her parents order food at a restaurant because her mom has an accent that is not considered American enough. And she feels, and she's not the largest frame, but she feels like she has to regularly step in and is much more vigilant now than ever before, when it comes to like them going outside. And so this is affecting, you know, people in multiple generations.
And I think there was a second part to that question about let's see here, as a community, you know, what is it that we can do to help address and support the state of mental health? You know, unfortunately, that, you know, as a person who studies Asian American mental health, there's a lot of skepticism in the Asian American community around seeking mental health services, and there's lots of reasons for that, which we won't specifically get into here. So there isn't a strong strong precedent for seeking mental health services when these types of things happen, right? So some of it is a longer term goal that therapists like myself have to do to provide education about how it's okay and how these types of services are helpful, and you know, sort of destigmatizing seeking mental health services. And I think that's a little bit of a longer term issue, but I think lots of different groups are highlighting these types of things. You know, if you are a provider of mental health services, making sure that your staff get training on these types of issues that are facing Asian Americans in the very moment. I think that's really helpful. Outreaching, right? Reaching out to Asian American communities and saying like, hey, listen, we have these services. We know that this is an issue. If these things are coming up for you, we're happy to help. We are hopefully culturally competent enough to address these types of things and have these conversations with you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, which I see one in the chat. So while I am Filipino American, I have an Irish last name due to marriage. Someone once mentioned to me that you don't look Irish. How should I best respond to that comment?
I will actually respond to that because I have a Barger last name, and a lot of people, when I have a lot of stories about that last name. It's my husband is, again, Caucasian American, and I just always look at carefully when people see the name and then they see me in a state of shock. But I would say the best way to respond is asking them, why do you say that? You know, just asking them, come back with the questions like, why don't you think I look Irish? And just start a conversation. You know, I've had a lot of people asking me, oh, I was shocked. You don't look like a, you know, Dr. Barger. And I was like, well, what do you think I look like? And then it's just like a lighthearted joke. You know, obviously, you know, I get tired of answering these questions, but it's good for them to kind of asking them with a question and have them really understand, because let them try to answer it and have them be aware of their worldview. And I think it's a great way to ask them with a question so that they could see, oh my gosh, I have to be careful with what I say. And it really is a good way to step like and build a dialogue with this person if you know them quite well. And it's just again having them be aware of their own biases and their own assumptions too.
Thank you. There's also a question about if you have any favorite Asian American writers or films, if you want to share, or you can share that with me later via email, and I can send that to the group of attendees. So that'd be a great resource to have. So, and I think we are coming up on the hour. Any final thoughts from our panelists? This has been just wonderful.
For books or authors, we have a whole resource list on our website that they can just kind of lift, and it's mixed with some Christian stuff. And so if you want to read that stuff, you can. Otherwise, there's a lot of non-Christian, just basically history, literature, novels, and things like that that you can read that's Asian American. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, Dr. Barger, Ray. Yeah, any final thoughts?
Just grateful to the town and the Wheaton Public Library for hosting this conversation. And I think folks showing up is really important and really great, right? Being aware of these types of issues, that they're here and that they are relevant to this community is a really important step.
Yeah, again, I just want to also thank you so much for this opportunity to just that we have a platform to share our experiences and share about the stereotypes as well. And I hope this continues to build on conversations. So again, my takeaways is just to listen to our stories and just to be kind to one another.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. A huge thank you to our co-sponsor, the City of Wheaton Community Relations Commission, for making this possible. So we're right at 8 o'clock. We can end on time. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Everyone have a wonderful night. And yes, be kind. Be kind to one another.